Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the IHR Digital History Seminar. I'm very pleased to have you all here, and I'm even more pleased to have Dr. Zoe Alker with us this evening, who's going to be talking to us about data mining convict tattoos, 1788 to 1925. Dr. Alker is a lecturer in the Department of Sociology, Social Policy, and Criminality at the University of Liverpool. She's the author of numerous articles and has been involved in a number of funded projects. She's very much interested and concerned with the history of crime and justice in the 19th century, and particularly using digital analysis and digital techniques, as well as interdisciplinary social research techniques to recreate the lives of families, neighborhoods, Victorian offenders. And I'm very, very pleased, and I'm sure you all are all to welcome her and to hear her talk this evening. I'll pass over to you now, Zoe. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So good evening. Can you see the slides okay? 1 second. Sorry about this inevitable technical. Is that okay? Good evening, and thank you very much for inviting me to the Digital History Seminar series. I just have a little bit of an issue with Zoom here, so I'm just gonna, that's it. So good evening, and thank you for inviting me to speak at the IHR Digital History Seminar series, and it really wouldn't be a digital humanities event without some kind of technical mishap, so I apologise for that initially. But I wanted to extend my special thanks to James and Richard for organising this, and especially to Melody, not just for organising this, but also for being such a valid and generous contributor on this project's advisory board. And today I will be discussing a JISC British Academy funded project led by Professor Robert Shoemaker, who was the PI from University of Sheffield, and myself. And the project was developed by Sharon Howard, whose data visualizations we'll look at today, and implemented by and developed by Jamie McLaughlin at the Digital Humanities Institute in the University of Sheffield. So by the late 19th century, tattoos had developed a notorious reputation amongst Victorian observers. Tattoos, according to criminologists and social investigators, including Henry Mayhew and Cesare Lombroso, were part of a criminal argot, a discrete code shared among the notorious criminal classes of Victorian London. But research recently undertaken on our project has shown that tattooing had very little to do with expressions of a criminal fraternity, but in fact grew in popularity and acceptability over the period. More importantly, perhaps, through the application of digital humanities methods, we've been able to assess the identities, emotions, and fashionable sentiments of ordinary working class people in England and Australia in the long 19th century. Now, of course, tattooing has taken place throughout human history. Evidence from bodies preserved in ice indicates the existence of the practice as early as 4000 BC. And while it is impossible to trace a continuous history, there is evidence of tattooing in most cultures, sometimes as a form of forced stigmatization, such as branding of slaves and criminals in the Greek and Roman empires, but in many cases as a voluntary practice used to express identity. Now, as typically the only record of the tattoo is the body itself, few records survive of the practice before the advent of photography. One exception to this is the written descriptions of tattoos and occasional sketched images that were kept of institutionalized individuals who were forced to submit to the recording of information about their bodies as a means of identifying them. And this particularly applies to three groups from the 18th and 19th century: criminal convicts, sailors, and soldiers. So the research I'm going to talk about today is based upon descriptions of the physical appearance of convicts created by the British judicial authorities from the late 18th century to 1925. Such records were first kept in large numbers for the convicts transported to Australia from 1788 to 1868, since Australia was an open prison and the authorities needed some means of keeping track of convicts. Similar records started to be kept of those imprisoned in Britain from 1816, in part so that escapees could be identified. But the practice became more systematic, with a growing concerns about recidivism in the late 19th century, since those identified as having been convicted more than twice were subject to more severe punishments. But why are tattoos important to us as digital historians? Well, if we ignore the relatively small number of marks imposed by the state, such as soldiers and sailors who were branded with a D for desertion, for example, tattoos are a form of expression by individuals for whom typically no other records of their sentiments survive. Studying convict tattoos allows us a rare glimpse into their beliefs and attitudes, even if, as we shall see, interpreting this evidence is fraught with difficulties. So these records allow us to see, for the first time, that historical tattooing was not restricted to sailors, soldiers, and convicts, but became a growing and accepted phenomenon in England over the course of the 19th century. As a form of history from below, tattoos provide an important window into the lives of the working classes, whose voices are often obscured from the historical record, and giving us an intriguing opportunity to understand the identities, fashions, and sentiments of ordinary working people in Victorian London. Now, this research takes advantage of an enormous body of records of convict tattoos. We came up with 76,000 descriptions assembled into the digital Panopticon database that was launched in 2017. You should be able to see the homepage on your screen now, and you're able to search these records for convict tattoos and use data visualizations dependent on your question, from pie charts and Sankey diagrams and so on. So do feel free to have a go at that. We've got the link at the very bottom of at the very end of the paper. But the digital Panopticon linked together some 4 million records about convicts from 50 criminal justice data sets in order to assess the impact of punishment on a range of individuals. And there were 250,000 individuals for which we had life archives. And to do this, we used automated record linkage to link together criminal justice, biometric, and genealogical data. For a historian, I could never say that word. This is a collaboration between the universities of Liverpool, Sheffield, Sussex, Oxford, and Tasmania, and was implemented by the Digital Humanities Institute, also responsible for this project in Sheffield. And what the digital Panopticon allows the users to do is it provides a comprehensive search facility that enables people to search from a wide range of personal characteristics and life events. And it also allows you to identify patterns in large bodies of data, including now tattoos. Now, one of the core project challenges of the tattoos project was really to ask, how do we use a computer to extract data that we need on tattoos from the complex physical descriptions, which also have lots of non-tattoo related information. So how do we link information about the content of tattoos, their designs, anchors, hearts, initials, to the parts of the body where the tattoo was located? And we can sort of see the problems here when we look at the evidence at the top of the screen from John Harrington's tattoo that was recorded in 1881. Mole on right cheek, female dancing, crucifixion on the right arm, banners of war, Adam and Eve, tree ship and bracelets on left arm, scars on neck. Extracting and analysing information about tattoos from physical descriptions of convicts was not straightforward, because these descriptions were often entered into the same column on a form and contain a wide range of other information that includes their physical characteristics, it might be their eye colour or shape of face, their bodily infirmities, and personal details such as occupation and religion in a variety of different written formats. So one of the core challenges in this project that the development of digital humanities methods was that enabled for us to kind of decode was to extract the information about tattoos from all the other information in these descriptions. We initially wrote the bid to include machine learning for this work because it does require training data, but that would depend on the tattoos having already been correctly identified, and we didn't have that. So we used some approaches derived from it and developed the following kind of 5-stage approach that you can see on your screen now, and I'm going to spend the next few slides talking about each one of this process and then discussing some findings towards the end of the paper. Now, digital humanities methods were integral to the successful extraction and analysis of this data. And the funding from the scheme really allowed us to develop a platform that allowed us to understand the importance of iterative processes, as we need to test different extraction methods against the evidence and use pattern matching to deal with exceptions. And the data is messy, it's flexible, and so varied and flexible methods are required. So our first stage was to divide the text into single words and multi-word phrases, and then manually assigned a type to each So, for example, we had design for tattoo, we had written words as a particular form of tattoo, the body part, the body specifier, which is the left, right, upper, back of the hand, for example, and also the hanging body specifier. So this is where the body specifier, such as right, might be detached from the part of the body it refers to, such as the hand. So those kind of ideas about it being right and hand were not always together. And we also included stop words, anything unrelated to a tattoo, in particular scars and moles gave us a lot of problems, and a separator. To determine body location, it was discerned that divisions in tattoo descriptions normally took place after the occurrence of a body part. So we couldn't rely on punctuation as it was too inconsistently used. I have an example of that now. So each combination of information ending in a body part was defined as a chunk and separately categorized. So you can see this in the example of Alfred Hitchcock, faith, hope and charity, hussar, ILM, which is a religious meaning, Jackson, L forearm, horseshoe, L band, woman and castle, wrist. That then becomes faith, hope and charity and hussar and so on. So we were able to kind of categorize the information by chunking it and making sense of it as part of our extraction. Now, to determine body location, it was discerned that divisions in tattoo descriptions normally took place after the occurrence of a body part. So each combination of information ending in a body part was defined as a chunk and separately categorized, as you can see in this example. But there was a problem with what we called hanging body specifiers, as in the second example that we have here, where we identified right as a hanging body specifier. In these cases, we created a new rule. The computer was told to look for the next body part in the description. So we know that HBIH and bust of jockey were on the right forearm. This and other exceptions to the basic rule about chunks were identified as regular expressions and then categorized as by pattern matching, allowing for anomalous wordings to be included. Now, onto the third section of our data was to assign the tattoos into subjects. And this was probably the most interpretive part of the process in terms of assigning subjects to the words identified as describing tattoos. So here's a selection of the most frequently used subject categories, although it excludes the most common type of tattoos, which was names and initials. Because the names and initials, well, I'll explain that actually on another slide. But the assignment of subjects was done manually by the team, paying attention to the context as we came to understand more about the meanings of specific terms. And then stage 4, we were tasked to link this information to what else we know about the individual convict based on the large amount of information assembled in the digital Panopticon in each convict's life archive, which is a cradle to grave sort of documentary, if you like, of their life, that you can assess the punctures of, or the interactions with the criminal justice system alongside social and personal and life course data. But it also gave us demographic information. So we were able to look at their age, gender, occupation, religion, and also their punishment, offence, and any previous convictions. And then finally, the 5th stage, our methodology was to tabulate, visualise, and analyse our data. Once the data was extracted, we had assembled a large amount of very diverse, detailed evidence. And the question was how to make sense of all these 76,000 tattoos. Our solution was to employ digital humanities methods and find forms of visualization, including not only the conventional bar and pie charts, but also heat maps and network graphs in order to identify patterns, concentrations of evidence, and connections between different types of historical evidence and data. One of our visualizations then included a heat map, and a heat map provides a clear way of showing how the subject matter of tattoos changed over time. Incidentally, because names and initials were overwhelmingly the most popular tattoo at 56% of all tattoos, they were actually excluded from this diagram because their presence would just overwhelm the other evidence that we wish to examine. So contrary to contemporary beliefs, convict tattoos included a wide range of subjects and designs and expressed some very positive emotions. We found multiple records of tattoos relating to British and American identity, as well as designs centering on diverse subjects like astronomy, pleasure, religion, and sex. Among the most popular were naval themes, however, and expressions of love. The distribution of subjects became more even over time, as some popular early themes, notably naval, jewelry, and astronomy, declined inevitably due to the kind of decline in transportation, perhaps. Similarly, there was a rise in tattoos depicting religion, nature, national identity, and death. As material culture surrounding death and mourning developed over the 19th century, death was commonly commemorated on the body through images of tombstones and wreaths, and RIP, or in memory next to the name of a loved one. And so, rather than expressing a criminal identity, convicts inscribed their bodies in much the same way as today, commemorating their lovers and family, coming of age, and the pleasures of working class life. And some 5% of convicts wore tattoos relating to pleasure. 16th birthdays, for example, were commemorated by tattoos of bottles. Alcohol, smoking, dancing, and cards were the subjects of a range of tattoos. James Allen, for example, wore a tattoo of a glass and a man smoking a pipe. And among Marion Telford's 9 tattoos was a man and woman dancing on her right arm. Sports were also celebrated. When William Lindsay arrived in Australia in 1854, his body was decorated with a full boxing match on his chest, as well as several other distinctive images, including a brig in full sail, a spouting whale, a mermaid, a woman on his right arm, sailor and flag, and a snake and 3 rings. Now, sex was also a theme, and we separated this from pleasure because we wanted to examine Victorian responses to this, both in terms of expressing sexuality through tattoos, but also in the way in which clerks managed this information. And we actually discovered that Victorian clerks often obscured the level of obscenity from the records. So part of Robert Dudlow's tattoo, for example, was described as an indecent word. But images of naked men and women were tattooed commonly on visible parts of the body. Convicts also expressed an interest in nature. Frederick Ashe, so birds were often kind of represented, often wrapped around the wrist or the neck to replicate jewelry. Frederick Ashe, who was convicted in 1889 at the Old Bailey of the rape of a 13-year-old girl, was recorded in the Register of Habitual Criminals in 1893 as having 25 designs on his body. These designs included an elephant, mermaid, girl on a donkey, snake, lion, and a unicorn, apparently as part of a coat of arms, chameleon, scorpion, another lion, and a tree centipede. Now, digital humanities methods have been absolutely crucial to being able to examine these patterns, analyse and visualise them. These data visualisations were completed by the wonderful Sharon Howard, who is just a genius with art and data visualisation and history. And she drew up a network graph for us for anchor. So 2 of the most popular themes were those relating to maritime culture and romantic and familial love. Naval tattoos were rich in diversity and included mermaids, ships, sailors, flags, and related astronomical symbols like the sun, moon, and stars. But the most popular design was overwhelmingly the anchor. Now, by using a number of visualization techniques, such as the network graph that demonstrates our collocations here, we can learn more about the intended meanings of the various designs. So despite terse descriptions and the fact that convicts never left records explaining their intentions, these particular methods provide us with a lens to examine those. So while we must remain attentive to Hamish Maxwell Stewart's warning not to impose our own interpretations, identifying the designs collated of the specific items is the only way we can shed light on their meaning and significance. So collocations then show us the related words, which words are situated with an anchor. And the collocations for this really popular image indicate that it should not simply be interpreted as a reference to the sea. The intensity of the lines on this network graph here show the strongest correlations and collocations. So since anchors were frequently displayed alongside hearts, bracelets and rings, crosses, flags, and the sun, moon and stars, we can see that it was also used to express love and romance, religious devotion, such as hope and anchor, for example, national identity, and popular cosmological religious beliefs. This is one of the very few sketches that are available to us within the data. Most of it isn't available that they've drawn the images. It's usually obviously in text. And so it's a real privilege to be able to see this one for David Ingley from the Millbank Prison Register in 1827. And it kind of justifies the use of collocations here by looking at the individual datum rather than the big data perspective. They're both working hand in hand here to justify our kind of use of collocations. collocations and how much they can allow us to dig deeper into the meaning of this through digital humanities techniques. So this evidence allows us to better understand the wide range of sentiments expressed in convict tattoos, rather than just assume that Anchor is purely to do with the Navy or naval life. And David Ingley, whose tattoo we can see here, was in prison for the second time at the age of 29 for theft, had anchors on both of his arms. On his right arm, 2 anchors were collocated with some initials, LV, a face and a heart, and on his left arm, the anchor was collocated with a heart, a mermaid, and more initials, TH. Unfortunately, we don't know anything else about Ingle, but it seems almost certainly that these were expressions of love, as well as of an affinity with things naval, given the mermaid. This next visualization allowed us to examine where the most dominant areas of the body that tattoos were worn. So Victorians, clearly as we can see here, chose to wear tattoos on areas of the body that were highly visible and not routinely obscured by clothing. The popularity of wearing tattoos on the hands and arms indicates that body art was worn confidently and with the intention of being seen, which similarly suggests that there was not widespread stigma in spite of the views of contemporary social observers, journalists, and commentators. Most popular subjects were outwardly worn. They wore a range of designs on the arms, hands, and chest, were dominated by public proclamations of love. Both male and female convicts bore the names and initials of loved ones alongside hearts and anchors. And these designs were commonly surrounded by other symbols of devotion that included affectionate expressions and portraits of faces. Henry Jarrett, for example, wore Love, H. Jarrett and Carrie on the back of his left wrist. Now, rings and bracelets adorn the fingers and wrists of male and female convicts and were a form of working class jewellery that, according to Bradley, was decorative, cheap and easy to administer. The prevalence of a ring on the third left finger amongst the data indicates, and there was a fifth of convicts that used this, that indicates that this was often used to represent matrimony. Given that so many convicts wore the tattoo as wedding jewellery, seems to me to suggest that it was a fairly well recognised and established practice in Hanoverian and Victorian working class culture. Now, unfortunately, the documents didn't record the size of the tattoos, and without photographic evidence, we're unable to know the level of coverage of the body. We obviously couldn't use character counts on the data itself, because obviously one word is longer, mermaid's longer than love, and it doesn't give you the kind of, even with punctuation breaks, which are so inconsistent, you wouldn't be able to measure how many tattoos they were, or even what their size was. However, it was common for convicts to wear multiple designs simultaneously, and the arms were by far the most decorated. So David Dean, a habitual criminal released in 1918, wore tattoos that encircled his right forearm. On the front of his right arm, he wore a female's head and I love SR. To the back of his forearm was a female, and the back of his wrist featured clasped hands and a heart. Now, it's a paradox that convict tattoos were worn in places of the body that made them so easily identifiable to the authorities. Relatively few were located on the back, the buttocks, or the thighs, which reinforces the view that tattoos were intended to be seen. This evidence further hints at the possibility that most tattoos were either self or peer administered, as recorded on the convict ships at times, but also before the introduction of commercial tattooing in the late 1880s. But this may be, to some extent, an artifact of record-keeping practices. We don't know, for example, how often convicts were fully naked when they were examined, as opposed to being only stripped to the waist. We are unable to know yet for certain how routine recording practices of the body were within the justice system. It's not clear if tattoos were recorded from the lower half of the body in any routine fashion, and there is even less knowledge of the documenting of convict women and women in the prison system. The covered parts of the body were less frequently tattooed than the arms and hands, and hidden areas of the body were also not a place to exhibit risky or subversive tattoos either. Instead, many chose the same formulaic designs, anchors and hands, as those that were exhibited on their arms and hands. Instead, Victorians decorated their body to exhibit and drew upon fairly conventional shared fashions in order to be able to express their identities and emotions in the 18th and 19th century, not unlike today. This particular graph allowed us to plot how many, was there an increase in the number of convicts who were tattooed. So it measures the percentage of convicts with tattoos by their year of birth as time goes on. You can see that there's a very clear increase there in terms of the number of tattooed convicts by the end of the 19th century. Now, knowledge of tattooing by this point was obviously spread by tattooed freaks on display, that's their word, not mine, in circuses and fairs. I wear a lot of tattoos, funnily enough, on display in circuses and fairs, and returning sailors and officers from Pacific voyages. There was also the growing publicity accorded to tattoos in print through art and literature towards the end of the century. And of course, public awareness of tattooing in the 1870s was spread by the widely publicised court case of the Tichborne claimant, when an imposter, variously referred to as Thomas Castro or Arthur Orton, claimed to be Roger Tichborne, the missing heir to the Tichborne baronetcy. I can never say that word right. His claim collapsed in 1872 when it was revealed that Roger possessed distinctive tattoos, while Castro Orton, as our records confirm, had none. And in the 1880s, a tattooing craze developed in the elite society after it became known that various members of the nobility and royalty, both male and female, had acquired tattoos, including Edward the Prince of Wales and the Prince Albert Victor, his eldest son. Now, this craze was facilitated by the development of professional tattooists who set up shops, and by the invention of an electric tattooing machine in 1891 by an American, Samuel O'Reilly. By 1900, tattooing had permeated many parts of British society. As the century progressed, there was an increasing number of tattoos of recent inventions and fashions too, which is a nod to the development of tattooing practices. We had hot air balloons, bicycles, and propellers that obviously developed alongside the advent of commercial tattooing from the 1880s onwards. Excuse me. Emblematic of the popularity of tattooing at the end of the century are the 392 convicts in the database, all male, who had a tattoo of the American showman Buffalo Bill. The first tour of his Wild West show in Britain took place in 1887 when he performed for Queen Victoria. His London shows alone attracted 2.5 million customers, and he returned for further tours for the next 15 years. It appears that tattooists took advantage of his popularity by developing templates of his image and offering the tattoo as part of the experience of going to the exhibition. So there's a notable concentration of buffalo tattoos that appears in the data from the late 1880s onwards. The Buffalo Bill tattoo was often placed next to images of women, indicating that visitors would see his travelling show with loved ones and commemorate the event with tattoos. Charles Wilson, for example, whose tattoo you can see here on the slide, wore tattoos that included 2 hearts, 1 pierced, clasped hands, which is a reference to praying hands, and an anchor on his right forearm. And on his left forearm, he wore a bust of Buffalo Bill and the word Maggie in capital letters in a scroll. Now, evidence of tattooing outside the convict record, as historians such as Matt Lodder have acknowledged previously, is sparse and fragmentary. There are, however, tantalising suggestions that people from a wide range of social backgrounds acquire tattoos. On the one side, these tattoos are documented on their entry into prison and also highlight a real breadth of kind of cultural interests. But we also might look to the occupations. Alongside the thousands of labourers and unskilled workers with tattoos in our records, we had 60 clerks, 49 dealers, 22 agents, and 20 engineers. Now, the sheer breadth of activities in the list of the top 50 occupations is incredibly impressive. We wouldn't assume that these are in any way middle class, but it shows us about the diversity of working class and how tattoos certainly didn't seem to receive stigma or affront the kind of working class respectability. So if we, and you can actually have a go at this on the website as well, it allows you to use HISCO categories. So using the internationally agreed system of historical occupational classifications, HISCO, we can see that while just under half of the occupations were unskilled, another 40% were lower or medium skilled manual or non-manual workers, and 10.4% can be categorized as lower managers, professionals, clerical and sales personnel. Now, obviously, a minority of these occupations might be deemed middle class, but the widespread of working class occupations among tattooed convicts demonstrate that 19th century tattooing was a widespread and generally acceptable practice. It also supports the consensus of historians of 19th century crime that the idea of the existence of a criminal class is based on largely fallacious information. It's a myth that, as Godfrey, Cox and Farrell and Clive Elmsley have described, has no clear distinction that can be made between a dishonest criminal class and a poor but honest working class. It's worth noting that while we've examined convict records here, the internal evidence within the convict data strongly implies the wider social and cultural spread of tattooing, given the range of occupations and cultural references in tattoos from outside of the institutions of criminal justice, such as Buffalo Bill, such as the naval tattoos also. So it's further worth noting that convict tattoos were documented on entrance to the prison. And while they may have received a tattoo during a previous period in prison, many of these were habitual criminals, so served prison at least 5 times, condition in prison did not allow that. So particularly the more sophisticated surveillance of the late 19th century prisons. But we also have shown that we've got more widespread evidence of tattooing in non-criminal justice records. So we are actually looking for evidence in, say, foundling hospitals as well. But as historians have examined before, given that most of these are recorded on the body, it's very, very difficult to find outward examples of this, particularly in working class culture outside of the institutionalized. So the diverse range of designs and subjects suggests that tattoos were very much embedded in the wider culture of England in the long 19th century, while the demographic spread of the tattooed and the public location of most tattoos suggests that there was not much stigma associated with body art. Further evidence from popular culture is necessary to really show the popular nature of tattooing outside of the individuals documented within these institutional records. But we have begun to piece together the various fragments of this history. The upper class craze and middle class craze in the 1880s, and also their presence in orphanage and foundling hospital records, in art, exhibitions and literature. So our data demonstrates then that tattoos grew in popularity. And rather than express membership of a distinct criminal class, convict tattoos were used to express a range of positive and fashionable sentiments, not unlike today. And finally, it's important to conclude by outlining points that highlight the importance of developing digital humanities methodologies, in particular to the successful extraction and analysis of our data. The funding from the BA GIST scheme allowed us to develop a platform that allowed us to understand the importance of iterative processes. We needed to test different extraction methods against the evidence, and we needed to use pattern matching to deal with exceptions. And this is difficult because the data is messy, flexible, and so varied methods are needed. We also face the challenge of coping with different levels of analysis: the chunk, the entire description of a tattoo on a single person, the entire description of physical marks on a person, and the collection of evidence pertaining to a single person in their multiple record life archive. That required the creation of separate, interlinked databases and the need for clarity as to which records were being analysed at any one time. And so we were extremely grateful to British Academy and GIST for funding this collaboration and reinforcing the importance of digital humanities methods for studying our uncomfortable and difficult pasts. Our final slide just links you to various project resources. This is some writings on the website, and if anyone wants to contact me afterwards, then my contact details are on there. If anyone wants to sort of discuss the digital development side, then the DHI's website is on there as well. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Zoe. That was excellent. Very brilliant presentation and a fascinating project, a really, really fascinating project. We've got a couple of questions already online, and I'm sure some more will come up already. I'm going to begin with Melody, since she's been really working hard already, so I think we can give her the first question there. And she posted up the following question. Considering the nature of your sources, to what extent is it possible to consider composition placement when determining collocation? Has this information simply been lost?
Sorry, I lost you at the end. Oh. I lost you at the end, Richard. Sorry, just repeat that for me.
I'll repeat the question there. Considering the nature of your sources, to what extent is it possible to consider composition placement when determining collocation? Has this information simply been lost to us?
I'm not entirely sure what you mean by that. Could you just explain that to me? That makes me sound really stupid.
No, I think what she's getting is the composition of the tattoos and the placement of the tattoos, and then how do you relate that to collocation?
Do you mean placement of on the body.
I think she means that, but she may whisper in your ear because she.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm with you. So you say, yeah. So now this question is about placement, sort of within the text. Yeah, it's about the closeness of it rather than it being above it, if that makes sense. So we did measure that against body placement as well to see, as we kind of explained earlier with the hanging body specifiers, about whereabouts exactly it is kind of on the body and whether or not it was mentioned. So if we had an L, and then it would describe the tattoos on the right forearm, we were able to intuitively know that that meant the left forearm, and we were able to do that through pattern matching. I think there's actually, in terms of whether everything's lost to us, no, I think this is actually the data that we have. I mean, I think this is always one of those things about research projects like this, is you have so much data that you end up getting rid of, that, you know, in particular, the scars and body infirmity data was really, really rich to us. And me and Bob were kind of desperate to do something, and we're developing that with a project with Professor Karen Harvey at the moment. And so, yeah, so I don't think it's necessarily lost to us. No, I think we've kind of helped that with the techniques there. Got another chat.
Yeah, we've got another question. We've got a few questions actually. I'm going to go to Philip first, and then James is going to give one live. So Philip had a question about broader one for other projects, and he asked about any tips for applying methods like these to other similar big, messy social data sets, please. What to look for in terms of how to chunk the data, best practice for data visualization, and those kind of things.
Yeah, so I really defer to Sharon Howard and Jamie McLaughlin in terms of that kind of digital data. And we do have a really detailed write-up on the methodology of the website that might help you. I think the important thing is it kind of proved to us that outside of the digital, the value of the historian is really important here, because it took a lot of manual checking. And there was what's really important with this was the iterative process, is that continually having to test and refine these particular techniques. Now, I think in terms of visualization, being able to use different visualizations that go beyond bar charts and pie charts really allow us to examine deeper relationships. And that's obviously using different techniques that might be more appropriately used with corpus linguistics, such as collocations, for example. So I think it's about being experimenting with these different methods. No data is clean. It's how messy it is. You know, I've worked with British Library data that can often be an absolute nightmare. And we're very fortunate on this project to have relatively clean data. However, it is very varied. So I think having clean data and moving on from there and experimenting with different visualizations and different analytical techniques is probably what I would advise.
Lovely. Thank you, Zoe. We'll go to James next, and then we've got 3 or 4 more questions on. So James, go ahead.
Okay, James Baker, one of the seminar conveners. Okay, so I've got a question about your descriptions that you're using here, Zoe, and it kind of relates to the point you made before about linguistics as a methodology. So I know you didn't necessarily go down fully that path for using linguistics, and I'm not necessarily saying you should have either. One thing that really intrigued me about the descriptions when you had them on the slides is that they kind of have they kind of look right, they kind of look objective, but they seem to have some kind of like logical structure, and obviously their structure was consistent enough that you were then able to chunk them, right? And that means they are a genre in a way. They're a genre of description, they're a genre of cataloging almost.
Yeah.
And I got a couple of questions about that then. So I guess my first is, like, do you have a sense of where that came from, that kind of structured description? Did it just emerge from thin air, or did it come from other existing practices?
So
you talked about the subject matter changing over time, and I wonder whether they also the structured description itself evolved over time during the course of the period.
Yeah, well, that was one area. So I'll go backwards. I'll start with your last question and then go back forward, because I've been Zooming since 9 a.m. So I'll probably ask you to remind me of that one. Yeah, so the reason why we were unable to so we took account of the different recording practices, and actually it's quite consistent throughout the 19th century because they all use the same recording book that's used right across the colonies. So that gives us some kind of standardized format in which to do so. The messiness of the data is in the categories of physical descriptions, and that's where you have tattoos embedded with a range of different information. So it's within that we really had to focus our attention. We also thought about developing ways to examine those recording practices and did they change, but that would have been problematic due to the nature of the sources and the data itself. We would never have the answer. And then going back to your initial question, which was about subjects, yeah, I mean, that was the most interpretive part of the process. I think that was data driven though. You know, we did some preliminary analysis on the frequency of designs that kind of took place after the extraction, and that enabled us to kind of group them by subject. Now, obviously the collocations kind of enriched that as well because they allowed us to see different and multiple meanings of the different designs within them.
Fascinating, thank you.
Thank you, Zoe. Another one from online. This is from Larry Cibola. I hope I'm pronouncing his surname correctly. Who's very interested in the Buffalo Bill and involved with Bill Cody studies. So he found that tidbit on the frequency of the Buffalo Bill tattoos, which Bob Shoemaker actually gave this specific number to on the chat.
Yeah.
Fascinating. And he says, is there anything else you can tell us about that? And alongside that, is there other contemporary individuals who were equally widely featured in such tattoos?
Yeah, so royal figures actually kind of emerged with tattoos. That was, you know, the Queen Victoria kind of emerged as a symbol. I wish I had my sort of data up in front of me now, so I could just do a kind of quick sift. Usually the kind of descriptions of particular people were non-celebrities, so they were clearly people known to them. So it would say, you know, portrait of a face, portrait of a bust, and it would usually then have a name or names and initials underneath it, which kind of indicates, and I know this was a practice of tattooing when I was growing up, of having like somebody who's died or somebody that you love's face kind of tattooed onto your body. So I would assume it was that.
I've just sent it out. Yeah, are we on again? Hi, everyone. Just to say sorry about that. We had a brief little technical difficulty there. So I'm not quite sure how much of the previous question you caught. I think you possibly caught the first part of it where Zoe was talking about other very popular tattoos at the time, particularly related to royalty and other key figures. But I suspect you may have missed the second part, which was anything particular, anything else interesting in relationship to the Buffalo Bill tattoos other than the sheer number of them. What do you, Zoe?
Yeah, absolutely. So part of that, we found 392 references to Buffalo Bill that were clearly sort of using kind of hint. Well, we knew that this had come from Soho commercial tattooist in London, capitalising on the success of his tours within London. And what was really interesting is that Bob actually ran collocations of Buffalo Bill. And what we found was the bust of Buffalo Bill was always collocated next to a symbol of love. So usually a heart, or most commonly, like in the case of Charles Wilson, the name Maggie in capital letters. So we know that, and also from cross-checking this with newspaper evidence, that sort of men and their lovers were going to see Buffalo Bill and getting this commemoration of this on their tattoos. So that's kind of one of the major findings of Buffalo Bill. And of course, you can actually have a look at the Buffalo Bill data because it's available on the digital Panopticon website for you to have a look at from the tattoo. So you can really kind of have an examination of those 392 individuals and feel free to kind of explore further through questions that I'm sure with your knowledge of this, I think, was it Bill? Sorry. I didn't catch it, Larry. I think would be really interesting, and feel free to have a conversation with me after this on email.
Great, thanks, Zoe. The next question is from Ben Jones. And he talks about, I think he mentioned 4 million records of about 250,000 individuals. And what he wants to know is, did you find tattooing increases once people enter the record, i.e. a penal sentence, and exposure to others with tattoos? Yeah,
that's a really good question. Sorry, just repeat it again so I'm sure I've understood it.
Did you find tattooing increases once people enter the record, i.e. with a penal sentence, and then an exposure to other people with tattoos?
So the nature of the records actually allow us to examine sort of previous convictions and know their cradle to grave life narratives. So we know that there is, for example, evidence of tattooing in prison, but no, we weren't able to assess that kind of criminogenic relationship between whether or not you had a prison sentence and then were more likely to get a tattoo because of the nature of the data itself. These are records from the cradle to grave, but also with the Register of Habitual Criminals. These offenders have been sentenced a series of times, and we weren't able to accurately map the timing of when they got their tattoos. Also, given the varied kind of timing and chronology of the data sets themselves, we just didn't have that data, unfortunately.
We've got another related question, and I apologize to the questioner because I can't, I don't know the language which it's written in, but the question relates, it's a similar one. It's about is there a possibility of correlating tattoo theme with the crime and the location of the crime?
Sorry, Ray, Richard, say that again. I'm sorry, my sound went off.
Not to worry. So the question is there a possibility of correlating tattoo themes with the crime and the location of the crime?
So because of the data, we didn't have sort of a criminal that committed just one type of offence, and that would have been a step interpretation too far. You know, we're not arguing that these are necessarily inherently defined by their crime. So we wouldn't argue that a violent criminal, you know, necessarily had tattoos of criminal defiance. And what was the other part of the question? Was about location? Location,
yes.
Of the crime or?
Of the crime, yeah.
Yeah, so again, it's a bit of sketchy data on this one in terms of where they come from. Occasionally they're itinerant, but also the kind of data that we have on location of where people live in this period is from the census. And so it might also describe a kind of ward boundary rather than a particularly accurate point. In terms of the location of the crime, very rarely do you get the specific spatial location of a crime. So even the address of the victim offender is very difficult to get from historical records as well.
Great, thank you very much, sir. The next question, well, the two questions actually are from Dries Boschart. I'm not sure if I pronounced his surname correctly. Apologies, Dries. It is tattoos and religion and the category of religion, and you defined them as relating to Christian religion. And what he's interested in was, is there any tattoos that relate to other religious traditions? That's the question.
Yeah, so we did have evidence of Jewish traditions within there as well, but which kind of overlap with Christian traditions in terms of sort of the seven-stick candle. Overwhelmingly, these were Catholic and Protestant, and actually, incidentally, convicts would change their religious descriptions. So depending on which prison that they were being sent to or trying to get out of prison, I think Lucy Williams writes about this somewhere, or I've heard her say this in a talk, where the tattoos, the convicts will change their religion in order to be able to get to a better prison. So change from Catholic to Church of England. What we did find though was that that the Church of England was kind of overwhelmingly the most tattooed in terms of that particular group.
Interesting. And his second question, also related to religion, was, since religion's included in the demographic information of the convicts, has there any correlation been done with the tattoos related to religion?
Yeah, I mean, again, we did have a section on religion and religious tattoos, but in terms of linking that to other information is really problematic because of that nature of the way in which the records defined the religion and the religious status of that particular individual.
Right.
But, you know, common symbols would be crucifixes, crosses, and INLR and other kind of descriptions. Right. Clasped hands is probably, and prayer hands is probably the most overwhelmingly popular one, I think, outside of a cross.
Great, thanks, Zoe. We have another question from Terence Heng, and he says, given the global journeys of some of these individuals, is there any classification, observation of instances of tattoos with particular non-Western references, you know, Japanese text or other kind of images?
Yeah, well, hey, Terence, this is my colleague, my very highly valued colleague. Yeah, there is, especially in terms of Japanese. So we see around a sort of Japanese iconography, and I think this is because of the introduction of Japanese tattooing in the late 19th century. So one of the first professional tattooers was Japanese and was working in the docks in Japan, and was, I think, Prince Albert's tattooist, in fact, was Japanese, and they had commercial tattooing a lot earlier than the UK. And then it came over here as an influence. And so you do get this flurry of information about of sort of tattoos that relate to what's always described as a Japanese woman.
Right, lovely. I've got lots of comments on here, all praising the paper and really interested in a lot of the aspects of that. But I don't think we have any more specific questions at the moment. We're certainly open to more specific questions. That allows me as the chair to kind of take an opportunity to ask. And I'm kind of interested, Zoe, in the learning process of the project and the development of the project, and particularly I was really interested in the way in which you developed. You had your methodology and the development of that methodology, and in some ways I suspect there must have been some missteps in there, or ways she kind of thought, ooh, yeah, we've done that now, maybe we should have done that differently. And if you could explore maybe a little bit of that, and alongside that is, if you were redoing it from the start on the basis of your experience now, what you've done a bit differently.
I don't think I would have done anything necessarily differently. I think there are things that we weren't able to resolve due to the unmatching of the process and the data. I mean, I think, I need to reiterate, this project was, £10,000, having Sharon and Jamie, Bob and I, and we had a year to do it. And I think it really went above and beyond what was expected from the scheme. So I'm actually incredibly proud of it. And I don't know would I have done anything differently? No, I don't think I would. I think it really justifies that methodology. I think there are things that maybe I would have liked to investigate further through further research. So one aspect that Melody was actually incredibly helpful with at one of our hackathons was this issue of the back, because, you have the back, which implies that, you don't have self-tattooing necessarily. This has been administered by peers. It's not necessarily intended to be seen, but that always got jumbled up with back of the hand or back of the arm. So that was kind of one thing that kind of a tiny little thing that I would have liked to have examined. But actually, I think that it's not about this specific method. It's about being able to use these different techniques to knowing your data and really understanding your data and getting to know and test and refine that data in order to be able to come up with really surprising conclusions. It was always really exciting to go into the meeting room and find new evidence, about the Anchor or Buffalo Bill that you just would never have expected.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And in terms of the development of that 5 stages, I mean, is that something that how did you kind of come to that decision to do those 5 stages? Was that to a degree a bit of experience from some of the other, the people who've done digital projects before, or was it a bit of, doing a bit of test cases and things like that?
Yeah, it was an issue of both. I mean, this data and this project emerges out of a series of much bigger projects of which Bob has led. So, and Sharon has worked on, and Jamie has developed. So that includes digital Panopticon, but also the Old Bailey Online. So there's a real awareness of the data and the structures and the ways in which to manipulate and use these data sets. Just remind me of the first part of your question in terms of the development, the 5 stages of the development. Yes. Sorry, remind me of that again, Richard.
Well, it was just to think about how you actually came up with those 5 stages and sort of I think you've answered it already, but whether it was a bit of experimentation based on doing some trial thing or experience from some of the other members of the team who
Yeah, I think it was a bit of both. I think it was the kind of evidence the value of collaboration in digital humanities between historians of different varying levels of experience and knowledge, as well as kind of working with technological developers. I mean, like Jamie and Sharon, and initially we did aim to use machine learning techniques, but we didn't have the data for that. So it was always a process of experimentation and tweaking those techniques. Yeah, but we did have that really solid understanding of the data.
Yeah, excellent. Which I think is the basis of any good project.
Yeah,
you understand your material.
Yeah.
Bob Schumacher's been adding a few comments on there, but I think we can kind of follow on there. Great input there from the advisory group and other things, he says. And Arjun, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, has got a second question, is in relationship to manually tag various tattoo themes, and whether you considered topic modeling to segregate the themes.
No, I don't think that we did. I can't, but I'm not sure why. I don't think I could answer that one, I'm afraid.
But you certainly did. You did it manually, isn't it? In the end. Yeah. So in some ways, follow that up with Arjun, follow that up with Bob or with Sharon, perhaps, or something.
Yeah.
Great. Any other questions? I don't think we've got any other questions. I'm not sure whether James or Melody would have any. Otherwise, we do have a couple more minutes left. I've sort of used all my questions up. So it's really is a truly impressive project. And I just wanted to, I suppose, end with one last thing to think about future. And I know you mentioned in your talk, you mentioned some of the things you're working towards, but is there anything particular that you think you'd like to explore in more detail in a future project coming out of this?
Yeah, I'd like to examine sort of representations of the body and the impact of, what we have in terms of the convict database is an ability to examine not only, with occupation, age, gender, life course information, but also those kind of scars and infirmities in the body. And I think there's a lot of collaboration that we're hoping to happen with Professor Karen Harvey, who is using bioarchaeological methods. So we'd like to kind of develop digital humanities techniques alongside that project in order to get a real 360 degree of the body, and the impact of certain kind of industrialization, for example, certain working patterns on the actual body itself. I think that's one way, but I think our real central hope for this is that people use the data themselves and go onto the digital Panopticon resource and use this data to kind of inspire their work. And we'd love to hear about that going forward. People that I've got sort of an MRes student working on it at the moment, and I think it would be just really interesting to hear other people's use of it. And that's what we would really like the project to do, to be able to facilitate further research questions.
I'm certain that's going to happen, Zoe. It's such a rich resource, such an interesting resource. I'm absolutely certain, researchers at all levels are going to be using it for many, many years ahead. And I think that sort of leaves me with just two things to say. One, to thank you ever so much, Zoe, for finally being able to give me, and it was certainly worth the wait. It was absolutely worth the wait. And we've certainly worked very, very hard. So thank you ever so much for that. And I'll give you a round of applause. I'm sure everyone will as well at home. And just final thing, as James Baker, my colleague, has just said, in 2 weeks' time, we have our next seminar, the first of our 2 postgraduate panels. And stay tuned for information on that. And that's when we're back in. And thank you once again, Zoe. Cheers.
Thank you. And thanks to Bob for his help with this paper, as well as Sharon and Jamie. Just wanted to make that point of collaboration known. So thank you very much for having me. It's been a real honor and privilege. Thank you.
Excellent. No, privilege is all ours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.